Welcome to Pizza Quest. I'm Peter Reinhardt, and I'm here with our old friend Brigit Binns. It's been 9 years since we have been on together. We did a lot of filming in, where were we? We were in Salinas, California, at the Wood-Fired Oven Conference that Forno Bravo put on, and we cooked together. We have a lot of videos up on our site. But Brigit, a lot's happened in the last 9 years, and you've written more books. What are you, like 30 books out now, if I'm not mistaken? And
Who's counting, Peter? By the way, it's so nice to be here with you again.
good to see you. Good to see you. I I want to talk about your most recent book. At least I think it's your most recent book. I can't keep up with you. Called Rottenkid, which is a memoir. And most of your other books are food books. Your cookbooks. You've done
Mhm.
dozens of books for Williams-Sonoma, and I want to
Yes.
hear a little bit more about how you got kind of hooked up with them, because
Mhm.
that's a nice collection of topics that you've covered over the years, and and your life in the Central Coast area, the winemaking that you and your husband do, and the hosting of at your retreat center. There's so much going on in your life. So thank you for joining us today, and I'm really looking forward to catching up with you.
Well, it has been way too long, Peter, and I track you and respect you hugely, and it's always so exciting to see what you're up to. And also, I love the idea of talking about everything. That just makes me very energized.
Right. Yeah, and you've had a very unique and interesting life in your. I'll just throw this quote out because in the new book, one of the lines I think the first chapter is, "I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth and a knife in my back." That's pretty provocative. That's a great way to start. It's a good hook. A good hook. So we're
You
going to
know,
talk more about Rottenkid and your whole story and your journey. Um, but let's just let's just quickly, for the folks who haven't seen the earlier videos we did together or know much about you, can you give us a little brief sort of bio of your both your culinary journey and your life journey, and then we'll go deeper into it with Rottenkid.
absolutely, and that's an easy one because I've always known that food was a creator of love, a creator of happiness. And that's one of the actually quite few things that I learned from my mother. That's a whole other story in
Yeah,
Rotten Kid.
yeah,
But one of the great things I did learn from her was that you could make people happy by cooking for them. And that's been a constant all of my life. And when I suddenly found myself in England, married to an English investment banker who said, you don't have to work anymore. I'm like 27. I said, what? That doesn't compute at all. And he said, what have you always wanted to do? I said, well, I'd always wanted to go to professional cooking school. And so that's what I did for 6 months. I mean, it was 5 days a week for 6 months at an accredited school in Woking, England.
uh,
And most of the other people in the program were girls, women that were going to go on and cook for directors' lunches, because in England, they don't want their guys to go out to lunch because they're likely never to come back from lunch. So their
right.
company directors' lunches in-house in the banks and the corporate structure. But I didn't know what I was going to do with it at that point. I just knew that I wanted to do it. And it was a great experience. I learned some very weird things in that program.
Is it kind of
Some
like classical cuisine that they were teaching you?
very, the mother-daughter sauces from the
Yeah.
French culinary tradition. But in the first week, we made lemon meringue pie and steak and kidney pudding, and I thought, maybe I'm in the wrong place. But the headmistress, she said, no, no, we're just, those are kind of classic English things. I said, okay, but let's not have too much more of that. And
Well,
we did. Hmm?
about what year was that, Bridget, when you were doing that?
Oh, 85.
85. So shortly after that, there was a British TV series that came out called Pie in the Sky. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but
I didn't.
it's sort of a detective, as usual, English style mystery, but the protagonist is a semi-retired, detective who his real passion is cooking. And his dream is to retire and open up a little cafe that he calls Pie in the Sky. But he's a classically trained, chef, and he's got a phenomenal palate. But his favorite thing to make is steak and kidney pie, and it becomes the signature dish of Pie in the Sky.
You
So if
know,
you ever get a chance,
the pastry for that is made out of suet.
Suet. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I said to the teacher, what is suet? And she said, well, it's the fat that surrounds the kidneys. I'm like, oh, okay, in pastry, whatever, let's do it.
Right. It's like the comparable to lard from a
Yeah.
pig is
hmm
the lard from a cow. And but you're no stranger to animal cooking. I mean, you seem to, in fact, in some of your books, and even in this one, love to cook what meat. You're a meat cooker, over
I
fire
am.
especially, right?
I don't know how. I guess there must have been some kind of celestial thing going on, because I ended up doing quite a lot of meat books. Well, let's start with the King of Meats of San Francisco, Ryan Farr, Whole Beast Butchery. I was his co-author on that.
Oh, nice.
And that was hilarious as well. The video, when we made the video, it was the hottest day in San Francisco history, and you couldn't use the air conditioning in the room where we were filming because it made too much noise. So
Right.
of course now all of the protein is super floppy, and he's not used to cutting the protein when it's floppy like that. And also the entire camera crew were vegans. And so there was this little moment where like a gobbet of fat flew through the air and landed on the cameraman's shoulder, and he was like frozen.
Panic.
They
Okay.
ended up never using that very expensive video because it was just a total disaster.
Oh, what a shame. But what a, unusual thing. San Francisco, of course, rarely uses air conditioning, doesn't usually need it. And then I remember they had this crazy heat wave, what was it, a couple of years ago? Uh,
Yeah,
and then of course it's almost Portlandia-ish, but it's also San Franciscan-ish to have a vegan, camera crew.
absolutely. And then I
But
did I
irony,
did
irony lives.
The Cook and the Butcher for Williams-Sonoma, which was a break from their usual series. So it was a great big standalone book. And I worked with butchers in Brooklyn, New York, all over the place. And that was really a fascinating, but I did all the recipes myself, and I loved working on that book. And then of course there's our mutual friend Meathead.
Well, that's right. You work with Meathead Goldwyn, who we've had on a number of times. That's right. And he
Yeah.
loves you. Every
And I
time
love him.
he's always have you talked to Bridget lately? So yeah. So so were you his author, his co-author on that?
I'm the I've worked with him on many projects, and I was the co-author on the new book, which is not out yet.
Oh, looking forward to that one then. Well,
Yeah.
maybe when that comes out, we can get the two of you back on together.
Oh, I always have so much fun appearing with him. Jokes are flying, and we have formed a very mutually supportive working relationship together.
Excellent. So what's the theme of that book? Just
Um,
lots more recipes, or there particular?
the reason he brought me in is because he wanted it's the I don't know if they've settled on a final name on it. I think the final name is Meathead on Fire, but the gist of it was supposed to be bringing art into his work, into his oeuvre.
Huh?
Instead of the first book was more science, and this one, and so the reason he brought me in is because he wanted vegetables, ethnic flavors, spices, a more kind of pan-global approach to outdoor cooking. And because of my history with Williams-Sonoma and that book that I did called Cooking in Season,
Yeah.
he knew that I'm familiar with all the flavors of the world, and using lots of interesting, colorful veggies.
Nice. Well, you have kind of covered a full array of topics just on the Williams-Sonoma series alone. I mean, cooking in season obviously says it all, but you've done cocktail books, you've done sauces for Williams-Sonoma, low carb gourmet. This one you did a book. I don't think it's a Williams-Sonoma book, but I was curious about it. The Jody Maroney sausage book. What was that all about?
That was my second book ever. My first book was Polenta. And then I had gotten an agent when I first came from Spain back to Los Angeles. I was like, oh my God, I have an agent. I can't believe it. And they brought it to me. My agents brought me this this project? I said, yes. They thought I would be too snooty to do it. Sausages. I said, are you kidding me? That's my my middle name. So
Your
I
wheelhouse.
was very, very happy to. And those were all my recipes as well. So even though it was under the headline of Jody Maroney's Sausage Kingdom, he's like a Bruce Aidel's version in Los Angeles.
Ah,
And I had a great time, and I did the photography. I was the stylist on the photography on that one as well.
nice. Is Jody Maroney still, is he still, it's happening? Is he?
He is still happening. Yeah. I
Wow,
don't see his stuff up here. I think it's very local to Los Angeles.
interesting. Yeah, because Bruce Aidells, who's an old friend of ours, was very successful and built up his sausage company and then sold it off and is living the life now, you know. So
Good for him. They went to school together. Jody Maroney's real name is Jordan Monkarsh, and
oh,
he and Bruce Aidells were in the same classes together when they were coming up.
interesting. Very the probably Berkeley guys.
Yeah, yeah.
I wanted to ask you also, you did a book for the Palm, the restaurant chain, the Palm. Did you do their book?
I did. I did. Boy, oh boy, that was a huge project. 4 years I worked on that. Uh,
Really?
they flew me all over the country. That was during the time when they were opening a lot of new restaurants.
Yeah.
And so every time there was a grand opening of something, and whether it was Austin or New Jersey or Nashville, I would fly out there and get to know everybody, because my job was to get inside the structure, the family of the restaurant. And there was a big kind of one meeting. I was the only woman there, sitting in the back in the corner. There was a big meeting with a huge square table. It was so kind of mafioso-esque, unbelievable, with all these guys with microphones sitting around, maybe 30 guys
Yeah.
telling stories from the old days of the Palm.
Uh,
And man, what a privilege and experience that was to be there.
it's such an iconic brand, and to this day, it's my mom's single favorite steakhouse restaurant group. Yeah, the one in Philadelphia, which I'm not sure if it's even still there anymore because they've closed some of them. We have one here.
Wow, I know it's sad, but that was one of the first ones. And the pastry chef there, Jeff Bleakin, he
Yeah.
taught me to make this amazing. I'm not really a dessert person, but he had this brownie cheesecake swirl thing for a crowd. That's still my most favorite popular dessert.
Interesting.
Unbelievable.
So what would you say was the sort of the key takeaway about what it is about what was the secret sauce of the Palm that made it such a successful concept?
I think because they were really willing to do anything at the beginning. It wasn't a steakhouse at the beginning. When the two guys, Wally Ganzi and Bruce Bazzi, got off the boat
Yeah.
from Calabria in Ellis Island, and no, Parma, Parma. And they got off, and the guy with the paper said, "Where are you guys from?" And they said, "Parma, Parma." And he said, "Oh, the Palm, Palm." And
Oh,
that's how it ended up being called the Palm
who would
Restaurant.
have ever thought that? It sounds like, it sounds like, oh, it must have started in Hollywood or something with a name like the Palm.
Definitely not. No, it started on Second Avenue in New York, and it was just a little place. And they were right near a very famous newspaper cartoon company whose name I can't quite recall right now. King Pictures or
Oh,
something like that.
King, yeah, King
King.
Syndicate, something.
Yes, exactly. And so it was all going to be a red check tablecloth Italian restaurant. That was all they were intending to do. But these guys from King would come in and say, I want a steak. And one of the guys would run out to the butcher up the street, get a steak, bring it back, cook it up. And then they became a steakhouse just because they were willing to roll with the punches, and also super family oriented. I mean, not so much today. It's become a little more corporate today, but that was the beginning. I got a friend of mine, Michael Martin. He used to work at Angeli Restaurant in Los Angeles when I was the wine buyer there. And he was looking around, and I ended up helping him get a job there. He's still there. He still
Wow.
works for the company 20 plus years later. He's now the manager in Las Vegas. That's the thing. People start there, they stay there.
Yeah, they've got obviously a system that works. And weren't they also famous for like having sawdust on the floor or something like that? It wasn't for a high-end restaurant. It wasn't pristine white tablecloth. It was more rustic,
It
right?
it definitely wasn't pristine white tablecloth at the beginning, and there was a story about a some guy came in with his mistress, and then he died in the restaurant, and they didn't want to make a big scene, so they shoved him behind in the sawdust behind the bar until the end of service so that his wife wouldn't know that he had been there. I mean, this is the kind of old New York
Yeah.
stories that were, and that's in the book. It's not a huge secret. They love talking about the dead body stories.
So is that what your job was in writing the book, was to tell the stories? Because they already had the recipes. Did you have to translate or
Well,
create new recipes for them?
yeah, but Peter, you know what restaurant recipes are like. The
Yeah.
chef recipes, forget it. You try to reprint that, nobody's going to know what to do with it. So it was a double handled job. I was telling the stories and I was also adapting the recipes so that the folks at home could recreate them.
Well, that's pretty. So your agent did a pretty good job of getting you some gigs.
I actually got the palm on my own because a friend of mine had been working for, what's the other big steakhouse? There's so many of them.
Morton's or something.
Morton's. And so I talked to them. She brought me in to talk to them, and then she jumped over to the Palm, and she took me with her when she went to the Palm, and that's how I got that job.
That's like Coke and Pepsi, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's nice when things like that fall into your lap. You've had, it's a really good run of books. How much time? I know some books take longer than others, but like for your Williams-Sonoma series, which is mostly recipe driven, you're creating lots and lots of recipes. How long
Yeah.
does it take you to put one of those together?
It depends on what they say. Those are usually much, much shorter. And my slow cooker book, I remember I was driving across the country, which I did twice a year for 6 years just to avoid spending the winter in New York. But I was kind of broke at the time. I think it was '08 and everybody was broke. And I'm driving out to see my mother. And I thought, how am I going to that's when I first hung out with Meathead, is he offered me a sofa in his house to stay on in Chicago when
Okay.
I was on my way out.
I
So I
go
get
back.
this call from Williams-Sonoma saying, could you do a slow cooker book for us, really bringing color and texture and flavor, and instead of just the usual brown stuff. And I said, I would be thrilled to do that. Oh my God, my life is kind of saved. But they only gave me 3 months to do 150 recipes.
That's amazing. Yeah.
It was when I got to my mother's house, there were 2 slow cookers on the front porch, and I had them going night and day, chopping, 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 braising, garnishing, and filling up my mother's freezer with little individual Tupperwares with reheating instructions on the top of them. And she lived on them for 2 years.
That's incredible. So really your classical training plus your natural instinct and your your childhood training is developing a love for food. But through the classical training, then you were able to then sort of funnel that into almost any category of cooking, would you say? I mean, is this an accurate assessment of how it kind of all came together for you?
That is how it all came together, except for I will never say that I'm any good with desserts. And when Williams-Sonoma came to me and gave me a choice between either breakfast or ice cream, well, there's another little story about the ice cream, but I thought about it for 3 seconds and said, absolutely breakfast. There's no way I can live on, because in order to make the economics of cookbook writing work, you have to eat what you're testing. And
Right.
I hate waste anyway. And I thought, there's no way. But I also got hired. This doesn't count as one of my books, but it was The Joy of Cooking that Maria Garnaschelli did back in the late 90s. And
98. I was a contributor to that one.
interesting book, huh?
I did the
Very
bread chapter. Yeah. I
interesting.
worked with a few others, but I ended up taking the lead on the bread chapter.
The bread chapter.
Yeah.
I had the ice cream chapter. They just
I had
assigned
no
it to
idea.
me.
We could have run into each other back then.
Indeed. And so I went to Williams-Sonoma and I bought a $400 ice cream machine, the kind that you plug in, you're not the one that you put in the freezer with a bowl in the freezer. I
Yeah,
mean,
the
the
real.
top of the line. And I think I tested 26 ice creams in 4 days, and it kind of blew up and I took it back. A little
Wow.
naughty.
But Maria accepted your work, right? You got your recipes in there, and not everybody made the cut, as you probably remember.
Oh,
There
I
was
do.
there were casualties along the way of people who who were brought on the project, and then she didn't like the recipes they turned in, and she replaced them with other people.
Yeah, it was a very dramatic production, that book. There were a lot of casualties by the wayside. But I did learn something really important. I just assumed I always like full fat versions of things as opposed to low fat, or it's always been my thing. But I discovered that if you try to make ice cream with just cream,
Yeah,
it is so, the
yeah.
top, it's so greasy on the top of your mouth that it changes the whole, it wasn't good.
And as I've gotten more and more into the gelato phase of my life, which is really low fat,
Hmm.
uh, it's hard for me to go back sometimes to eat some of these like, graters and some of the other brands that are like full fat ice
Yeah,
cream or high fat ice creams because
right.
they kind of, you feel like they're coating your tongue
Yeah, I
as good as
agree.
they are, as much as I love them.
Yeah, but that was an eye opener for me. But and I also had the fudge chapter.
Oh, really?
I don't know
Wow.
why.
It's,
The reason why is because my friend Cindy Mouche, who is a wonderful, do you know, Cindy is
I
the
know
one
Cindy
of the
well. Yeah.
greatest. She was the pastry chef at Angeli when I was working for Evan Kleiman. That's how I knew her. And she was assigned the entire, as I recall, the entire dessert portion of the book. And so she farmed out to me ice cream and fudge.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I knew Cindy when she lived up in the Bay Area, and we were all
Yeah.
part of a collective called the Baker's Dozen. And we had kind of a, uh, a cooperative book project that we put out under the leadership of Marion Cunningham, the famous cookbook.
Wow.
Yeah, Glow Breaker. It was like an all-star team. Um, and it was actually a terrific cookbook. It didn't sell nearly as many copies as they thought it would, but I
Mm.
still use it to this day, 30, it's 20, 25 years later. The recipes in there are really,
Wow. Well, with that kind of an all-star team, that's not surprising. Wow, what a great project.
it's kind of a small world as we're talking, and I'm hearing about all the people and when it's a small community of people, but it's people
It
that like
is.
each other, and I think we found that to be true when we're exploring the pizza world through Pizza
Mhm.
Quest, and we saw that when we all got together in Salinas, that there's kind of this I don't know, I call it a kinship, a
Mhm.
tribal quality that we all share, that we're part of something that's
Yeah.
unique and special, and even a shared language.
I agree. And that I never would have met Chris Decker if it hadn't been for that event. And his sidekick,
Um,
remind me the name of
Michael,
his,
oh, John Arena,
yeah,
John
the two
Arena,
of
yeah.
them. What
And
fun
then
working with them.
have you been to his new restaurant down in,
It's too far away for me. I wish I could, but I watch him on Instagram all the time and he is so inspiring. I send everybody there.
when we met Chris at the event that you and I, first met at,
Hmm.
he was just he was the sidekick. John Arena was his mentor and his star and the star. So he was quietly, hovering in the background. And now Chris has become a superstar, rock star in the pizza world. And he was even featured in my recent book, Pizza Quest, is for his Sicilian pizza. It's one of his signature uh,
Ah, ah.
New York style Sicilian pizza and elevated it to another level. So
Wow. I'll
yeah.
have to check that out. I'm sort of sad that he's not in Las Vegas anymore because I go once a year with my husband for his Star Trek conventions.
Oh yes,
And
why don't you share with the listeners a little bit about your husband Casey, because eh, a lot of the people here might know him more than they know us.
oh,
If
I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah. Now he was on one of the Star Trek shows called Deep Space Nine for I think 4 or 5 seasons as
he was
an
like, was it
alien.
Damar, something like
He
that?
was
That's
you have it. His name was Damar, and
Damar,
he
Damar.
was an alien. And this is before Kim Kardashian. The name of the alien race that he was a member of was Cardassian. And it's just very weird. Now,
Irony does not. This whole conversation is all about irony today, I think.
indeed. But that's he goes on the cruises. I go on the cruises. We go to Las Vegas. He's got 4 coming up now. I think Nashville, Chicago, New Jersey, somewhere else, and lots of Germany. There's tons of
Wow.
conventions in Germany. They're big Star Trek fans.
That's a nice gig to be going to it's like Comic-Con, but all from one franchise, really.
Well, you haven't lived until you've been on a ship in the middle of the ocean with 3,000 Star Trek fans.
And are they all trekked out in their outfits and things like that?
Most of them are, yes. Many of them are, and there's costume contests and stuff. And there's this great organization called Gays in Space with like 3 A's, Gays in Space. And they do these great events and competitions and stuff. And it's really fun. Sometimes I have to go and find the only bar that's empty and just sit there and read my paperback for a couple hours and kind of escape.
That's funny, but it's its own universe for sure, and an expanding universe. It's like the Big Bang; it just keeps going out and out because of all the franchises that they've spun off. But when you have these conventions, do they get from all the different iterations of Star Trek? Do the original Star Trek
Yes.
cast members come and?
Yes. And the thing I would mention about that, the reason I think it's gone on for so long and will go on for much longer is that it's all about diversity and inclusion. And
Interesting.
it has been since the 60s, since the first show. It was all about, without stating this, obviously,
Yeah.
it was all about accepting other people, whatever, creatures who don't look like you, that everybody can coexist together. And I think a lot of the fans are sometimes challenged in a physical way or a mental way or whatever. And this family accepts everyone. And amongst the fans, there's an amazing warmth, and they see each other at these conventions, and the actors love them, and they love the actors, and sometimes a little too much. And it's a family.
Yeah, it is a family, exactly. And I think that for many people they found their, like Kurt Vonnegut used the term "karass," the people who were of their kin,
Indeed, that's what it's all about. And so I'm honored to be a very tiny part of it.
Like proxy, you are part of the community because your husband was how did you say Damar?
Damar, yeah. And so I'll be in the elevator and somebody will say to me, "Are you Casey Biggs's wife?"
Like, didn't he start out like at the beginning? He started out with his role was pretty small, but then it got traction, and the character grew on people, and he showed up in a lot of episodes.
Well, and his original audition was a one-liner. It was like, "In range, sir, shall I fire?" or something like that. And he said, "Why are they bringing me in for this silly one line?" And somebody whispered to him, "They have big plans for this character."
Ooh, nice. It's great. The words of that every actor wants to hear. Right?
Indeed, indeed. Yeah.
Awesome.
And
Well,
it's
you
very
guys,
Shakespearean too. I mean, a lot of, like, if you look at
yeah,
what's his name? Jean-Luc, Patrick Stewart,
yeah.
Sir Patrick Stewart. A lot of the actors are trained in Shakespearean theater, and that comes through in the
And
show.
there is a Shakespearean-esque quality about the whole series from day one.
Mhm.
From because my most familiarity with Star Trek goes back to the first season with Shatner and
Mhm.
first couple seasons, and I kind of didn't really keep up with it over the
Yeah.
following versions. But even then, there was always this. There's always something more going on here than just
Yeah,
a science fiction story about travel in space. There's a deeper theme at
indeed.
play. So, and it's the first time I've heard anyone sort of explain this idea that there was this what would you call it? A sort of an under theme, a deeper
Hmm.
underlying everything.
Yeah, I think they set out to do that, even though they may not have trumpeted it, but it was very much a subtle and constant presence in all of the shows.
Well, it struck a chord and it's working, so they were on
Mhm.
to something. Well, thank God because it's brought us a lot of joy over what 50 years now since they
Ay, ay, ay.
hard to believe. Well, which leads me to your latest book, Rottenkid, because there's more going on in that book than meets the eye. It's not just a silver spoon and a knife in your back, although that's a great way to kind of get the ball going. But can you explain a little bit about that? You talk about in the intro about being kind of raised in a quirky, unique family.
Well, from the outside, my childhood looked very privileged, but that's not, all that glitters is not gold. I grew up in Hollywood. My father was an actor as well. He was famous for being either the judge or the bad guy. And if you watched a lot of black and white TV in the 60s and then color in the 70s and even into the 80s, you would see my dad on pretty much every episodic show that was out there. And he did lots and lots of movies. Sidney Lumet was a big fan of his, and so cast him in he was in 12 Angry Men. He was,
Oh,
I
that's
think,
right. Yeah.
juror number 7, the kind of the blue collar guy, and Fail Safe and Patton and The Verdict. And he was on It Takes a Thief as a regular for a while. He took over as Bob Wagner's handler after Malachi Throne left. And
If people are familiar with those shows, what was his name? What's his
Edward Binns, Binns. So if you look on IMDb, it all comes up, man. He did live TV back in the 50s. And then of course he was actually blacklisted, which is a story. Somebody had his same last name that was in the Communist Party. And so he couldn't work for several years, and he had 2 young children, my older half sisters. He couldn't work. He was very resentful all the way to the end of his life. He was angry about that. And he had served
was he in with that Dalton Trumbo crowd of
not really,
so he
but
got
he was kind of, I think he was borderline socialist, and so he certainly those were his feelings, but he wasn't loud about it. He just ended up getting blacklisted because of this someone else with his name that had been a registered member of the Communist Party. And he had to write a letter. He served in World War II with great distinction, and he had to write a letter to the government stating that he was a proud American. And it almost killed him to write that letter. How dare they ask him? Yeah, that was
in
rough.
the book you point out that he was also an alcoholic, and that was a big part of the sort of the story here is the challenges. Or did that contribute to being blacklisted?
I don't think so. I mean, there were an awful lot of alcoholics in Hollywood at that point.
True. Yeah.
I don't think that had anything to do with it. But then my mother, I hate to bandy around these terms, but my mother was actually a classical narcissist. And she was a kind of a failed writer who could never get anything done and lived her life. I was sort of like an accessory. I think she decided to have a baby because she couldn't get the kind of writing jobs that she wanted to. And so she thought, well, I'm going to give up on that and I'll just be a mother. But I didn't toe the line. I mean, when I was about 12 or 13, I started to have my own personality, and she didn't like that at all. And so I was very much shunted around from school to school. And also she had an affair with the governor of California.
You mentioned that, yeah.
Like a 25-year affair. And I was always being sent off to make room for, summer camp or boarding school, 3 different boarding schools. And so she could, have her thing with my Uncle Pat, who was my godfather as well.
So are we talking about Pat Brown then? Was he mentioned in the book? Did you call him out by name in the book?
I did call him out. I knew that I didn't. I knew that I didn't want to. No, it's not. People aren't really very interested in that aspect. I was worried that it would be sort of salacious and that people would talk about it more than the rest of the book. But that hasn't happened because I think it's too far in the past for anyone. I was at speaking at a thing in book fair in San Diego, and there was this round table of about 8 gray-haired ladies in the front, and I said something about Pat Brown, and they said, "Oh, I knew that's who it was. I knew that's who it was." So obviously there some people were paying attention to it, but I knew I didn't want to bring this book out while Jerry was still the governor,
Yeah.
because it wasn't widely known. I think the whole California Democratic Party knew about it, and Pat Brown's wife Bernice knew about it, and I think Jerry likely knew about it too, but it was not widely known amongst
Did you
the
get to
public.
know Jerry as kids? Did you know each other, or at any
Oh
point?
no, oh no, no. That family was separate. Although he was my godfather, and I went to lunch with him and my mother constantly up at Pepino's in Brentwood,
Wow.
and he always gave me money on my birthday, and he helped me when I was in Southeast Asia to meet interesting people who helped me with my senior thesis. And he was very supportive of me, but the two families never met.
I see. Uh, so again, lots of interesting subplots and threads going through here. The title of the book, Rottenkid. I know you mentioned, I remember one line that I read in there saying, that you learned early on to not to compete with your, or to give your mother a reason to think that you were surpassing her or competing with her. Was
Indeed. Yeah.
that really is that
Especially
sort of what drives the narrative?
especially as a writer. I mean, a writer, she herself, who could never get anything done. I mean, she wrote a few articles for TV Guide. She worked briefly at CBS in New York after having had an internship at Mademoiselle magazine, which back in those days was quite a prestigious internship.
Yeah.
It was more than just a fashion magazine back then. And her editor at CBS said, I need this by Tuesday. And she said, well, do you want it fast or do you want it good? And he said, I think you're in the wrong job.
There you go. Yeah.
And that was her story. She could never get anything done. And so when I started writing cookbooks and publishing cookbooks, it was kind of an affront to her, and she absolutely ripped my writing to shreds at every opportunity. And if there was a picture of me in any, like the Low Carb Gourmet has a lot of pictures of me, and she would say, well, who did your makeup? You look so old.
Oh
It
boy.
was a kind of a constant sapping disdain of just disappointment realized from a very early age.
Well, there's the knife in the back, right?
There's the knife in the back, and it was very, very difficult. I mean, I guess these are first world problems. They are for sure, but it's really hard if you are constantly cut down. As a child, your parent is the expert. That's your guiding star. And if your parent thinks that you're a loser, you're pretty much gonna absorb that and believe that you are indeed a loser. It's very difficult to break out of that. And if it wasn't for therapy, I don't know that I ever would have broken out of it.
Well, a lot of people write memoirs. Memoirs are mostly written about, reconciling who we were at one time with who we are today and how we got there. Would you say that this book helped you to navigate that reconciliation?
Absolutely. It was difficult at times. And I have to say, I'm the narrator of the audiobook. And that was difficult because you're in a cubicle for 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
With a guy, kind of a weird engineerish, sorry, any engineers listening, but in a cubicle right next to me, and he's in my ears for 8 hours a day. And I'm talking about some very sensitive, emotional stuff. It was cathartic to an extent, but it was also disturbing because she kept carbon copies of every letter that she ever wrote to me my entire life. And after her death, I found them.
Oh,
She had said to me when she was going downhill, she had said, you're going to find some things you won't like. Understatement of the century. Her writing to her friends about how disturbed I was and how selfish I was. And I had thrown all those letters away when I first received them,
yeah.
little knowing that 40 years later, I'd find them all again.
So basically, she's projecting all of her own disappointed life onto you.
Thank you, Peter. I think that is correct. I believe you to be
I mean, that's
correct.
what it sounds like, pretty
Yeah.
classic, but, uh, so you bore the brunt, of her failures and,
Well, and the reason the book is called Rottenkid is because that's what she called me all of my life. And to me and to other people, like my rotten kid is off at summer camp right now. I'm so glad she's out of the way, stuff like that. And on her on her deathbed, I had her on the phone with her college boyfriend, who's still going strong at that point. And I was holding it. She was already onto the morphine at that point. I was holding the phone up to her ear because she couldn't hold it. And she said, you know what, Joe? My rotten kid turned out to be not so rotten after all. Oh shit, she's standing right here.
oh my God, I didn't mean for her to hear that. Well, this begs a question, and along the way, a lot of times in these kinds of situations, you got, the mother who you can please, but then you've got typically you'll become the daddy's girl. How did you have any kind of positive relationship with your father?
I had a very positive relationship with my father for a long time, except that he wasn't around very much. And that made him more desirable. But later on, and I think in the writing of this book, I came to realize that he abandoned me the same way he abandoned his first family, my two older half sisters. He just and he left me with a very dangerous woman, a very vitriolic. She had the sharpest tongue you can imagine, and she could cut people to shreds with it. And it took me until after his death to realize that he was an absent father and he left me alone with this dangerous woman. And you know, I do understand his difficulties. And one thing I do in Rotten Kid is, and I will just show you the cover in
Yeah,
which,
for those who are listening on the audio version,
oh,
we're just holding up a cover of the book Rotten Kid, a succulent story of survival.
yes, and that's me. And then in the picture, you can see there's a bunch of escargot, aka snails, on the plate. And
Yes,
then here's the one that's escaping, and that's me. I'm the snail that's
on the edge
escaping
of the plate.
from
Yeah.
the fancy plate of snails.
Wow. Oh, wow. So really, this book is telling the story of not only the narrative of what happened, but how you survived. And
But it's not just, I want to make the point that it's not just a mommy bashing book. And I do go deep into her childhood and deep into my father's childhood to help everybody, including me, understand who they were and why they got that way. And then it also it details my journey from majoring in Chinese studies and spending time in Hong Kong and Malaysia, and then ending up in England as the wife of an investment banker who 7 years later had a major meltdown, and we had to escape quickly to Spain because he couldn't work in London anymore. And that was when I started to bring my cooking education to the fore, where it started to pay off because he couldn't work. And so I started a catering company in southern Spain and catering to, expatriate Brits and Germans and stuff who always wanted sausage rolls. Can we have sausage rolls, please? And I would say, no, you can't. And I was really into Martha Stewart at that point. I
I was
had
going
her
to say, there's
first
a
book.
shades of Martha Stewart in this, and shades of Julia Child in
A
this.
100%, yeah. And I would say, okay, well, we're gonna have lamb and artichoke heart skewers instead of sausage rolls. Okay, all right. That sounds all right.
Yeah, wow. And then along the way, that marriage ended, and then you found Casey. Casey found you. How did you guys get together? And here you are now, married to an actor, right? So you married kind of your father.
I know, and their voices are very similar, which is
Interesting.
even scarier. My
This,
stepmother, Elizabeth Franz, who's another very respected theater actress, said, "Well, you finally come back to the fold."
yes, right. I mean, this book is just loaded with the makings of drama, the makings of conflict and yeah, a lot to work out. A lot. What do they say? A lot
Indeed.
to knots to untie.
Yes, indeed. Although the book ends before I met Casey. So I just didn't feel that that was, and no, there will not be a sequel, I don't think. I mean, look how long it took me to get enough distance from this first part of the story to be
Yeah,
able to write about it. I mean, I'll
yeah.
be deceased by the time I have enough distance to write about
But,
this bit.
but you really unpacked an awful lot, in this book that, of I don't know, you're stuck, the knots that have to have been tied up inside of you to work all that out. What were some of the key reconciling takeaways for you in the end?
Um, in the end, well, the other thing my mother said to me on her deathbed was, my beautiful daughter, why did we waste so much time being angry with each other? I think it was a rhetorical question at that
Yeah,
point because she was out of it, and so I didn't answer, but it left me really wondering why, and learning that forgiveness is important if you can find it within you. It's up to you to do the forgiving. And sometimes people have asked me, do I forgive my mother? Yes, absolutely, I do. Um, I even forgive my first husband for being unfaithful to me. And that was the most traumatic experience of my life and the reason I left Spain. But why carry that stuff around? It's just weighing you down. And by writing this book, I think, people say to me, how could you be so honest? How could you be, open yourself up like that? If you're going to write a memoir, you have to be willing to open your veins.
yeah.
Otherwise, what's the point? It's not going to be interesting to anyone else, and it's not going to be cathartic for you unless you are willing to open your veins.
Well, there you go. And like you said, unless you do, you really can't get to catharsis because then it's just an exercise in.
It's just a weight weighing you down. Why not? It's like decluttering, the physical side of decluttering, right?
Yeah,
It's like that, which is something I'm trying to do right now because I have 8 grills. It's there's just too much, you
right.
know. I'm entering into that phase of my life where I'm decluttering physically, but it's the same thing mentally. Decluttering, forgiving, moving on to the next adventure, which I'm sorry, I'm not going to go gently into that good night. I'm gonna reinvent or I don't know, find out what is the next challenge, which I don't think is any more cookbooks, to be honest.
And then you get to a point, I think I feel that way about cookbooks also, is that if I'm going to do any writing, it's got to be about something else.
Mm.
Uh, you've lived a life, full of experience and drama, and somehow, repurposing that into a work of
Mhm.
art is, the logical next step. At least that's how I feel about it as well. And I think,
Sometimes a little bit too much drama for my own taste. I never set out to find drama in my life. It just kind of catches up with me.
well, Nora Ephron, used to tell the story that, every time she had a horrible breakup with a boyfriend or husband or whatever, and she'd go run into her mother would say, "Hey, more material for your next book."
Which is true. And, the worst possible example of that going badly is Truman Capote, of course,
Yeah.
because he wrote about the trauma in his life and the people in his life, and it all boomeranged back on him and it made him very unhappy. But if you know a writer, you got to be kind of sanguine about the fact that you may appear in print one day.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Well, so speaking of which, do you have any book projects in the works right now, or anything that you without violating any confidences that you can talk about?
I can talk about it because it's kind of an offshoot of the first book, except for it's fiction. And what happened is when I was going through old papers looking for the letters and etc. that would help me to write Rottenkid, I found my mother's diaries from when she was in the Bahamas in the mid 50s, before I was around, before she married my father. And she was married to the US naval liaison to the governor of the Bahamas and lived a rather glittering lifestyle with gin and tonics and water
Yeah.
skiing, and this is all in these diaries, really juicy. And so I'm working with Casey because he's got an amazing ear for dialogue and plot and character development, but he's not really a writer. And so we're working together, which is
Yeah.
interesting and it has actually turned out to be good. And so it's based on those diaries, which is going to require me to go and spend some time in Nassau to look through archives and so I'm doing all kinds of research now and trying to write 500 words a day, and then we review it together. And the secret theme of the book, the underlying theme of the book, is going to be murder by fish.
Crossing into yet another genre.
Why not? Why not? Why not play with it?
Good. Well, it's and I think the idea of you two collaborating and using his strengths and talents in the theatrical world and yours in in the creative culinary, but also just sort of bringing together all that. Your own history is a creative ferment tank for stuff. I mean, so I'm looking forward to keeping yours. And of course, you've got the new Meathead book coming out probably soon, right?
I think it's soon, but it's been delayed several times for various reasons, and so I'm not sure exactly what the release date it is, but that's going to be
Is it
super
with 10 speed?
fabulous.
Are you with 10 speed press on that one?
No, he went. Who did he go back to? He was originally with Houghton Mifflin, and then it's escaping me, but he changed to a different publisher.
Because
And
his first book, Meathead, uh, was quite a bestseller for 10 speed. So I'm expecting that.
I don't think it wasn't 10 speed. I think it was Houghton Mifflin as well, the first book. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for many, 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 many months. And
Yeah.
Kenji Lopez Alt calls it one of the most influential books, cookbooks ever. And it's dense, but so informative.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's loaded. And I refer to it a lot whenever issues of, cooking meat come up.
Well, he can be a little controversial sometimes. He doesn't believe in resting meat. He says there's absolutely no reason to rest it after cooking.
He loves to bust myths about
Yes,
cooking.
myth busting. That was one
That's
of
right.
my jobs, was to help him write some of the myth busting bullet points.
And I'm sure that will be one of his future books. Will just be called "Busting All the Myths." Brigit, it's been so great catching up with you. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing, your journey. This is, you've had a very eventful, sometimes tumultuous,
Yeah.
highly wrought, and yet, you brought joy to so many people.
Oh, thank you, Peter. And thank you for letting me talk a little bit about some of the other books, because nobody's asked me those kind of questions, and it just brings back how much fun it was. And so this is a privilege to be chatting with you.
Well, for listeners who want to follow up on your own, BrigitBins.com is your website, right? And are you posting regularly? Like I've seen some posts on, trying to swim through a pool of Jello and things like that. Is that like a Substack thing that you're
That's
doing?
my Substack. I have 3, but the main one is Rottenkid Substack, and I'm having a great time. That's the Jello controversy. It's been going on for a long time, and
Yeah.
I love it when people weigh in with their opinions on, would you drown if
Yes.
you fell into a swimming pool filled with Jello?
That for those who are listening, think about that. Write to Brigit, check out her Substack, BrigitBins.com. Is that the place where they should find you there, or Rotten Kids?
Rottenkid on Substack or BrigitBins.com. That's where
Okay,
you
yeah.
find me. And
And I
obviously
know
on
I've
Amazon.
already had one nightmare about, like getting caught in a pool of Jello and not being able to swim to the surface.
I mean, would your fingers just go down through the Jello and you'd stay at the bottom? Or could you, I don't know.
We need somebody who's willing to volunteer to be the
Yeah, but how are you going to heat the
death by
water?
fish.
I have 400 sheets of leaf gelatin if anybody wants to try it.
There we go. All right, folks. We've been with Brigit Bins today. Thank you so much, Brigit. And folks, you can follow Brigit on her site, and we will look forward to catching up with you when the next book comes out. Maybe we'll get you and Meathead on together to talk
Oh,
about the journey of writing, bringing your two worlds together.
I would love that. And it's always so much fun to chat with you, Peter. Thank you so much.
And thank all of you for joining us today on Pizza
Yes,
Quest.
thank you.
We didn't even talk about pizza, but Bridget has a pizza book as well, and has
I
done.
do.
And we made pizzas together. If you go back to pizzaquest.com and put her name in the search, and you can watch us cooking together as well. So
That was
Bridget,
fun.
best to Casey, and have a wonderful next stage of your journey.
The next adventure. And to you as well, Peter, for your next adventure.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Bye.